Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to note that we certainly share the thesis that sexual violence in a conflict is a monstrous manifestation of cruelty and inhumanity that requires increased attention from the UN Security Council. At the same time, it is necessary to remember that the struggle against sexual violence is only one of the elements in the agenda of the Women, Peace, and Security Council. It is not the primary cause of the conflict and should not be looked at separately from other important factors of this agenda. First of all, from the problems of women's development, overcoming poverty, women's access to education in countries that are in a situation of armed conflict, which should be considered properly. In addition, it is important to note that the issues of sexual violence in a conflict should be discussed exclusively in connection with a specific region. It is obvious that each conflict has different causes and different dynamics, so any attempts to universalize solutions and measures to overcome this phenomenon are superficial and unproductive. Today, for example, we were told in detail about the situation in Sudan. At the same time, we regret to note that the UN-related structures prefer to rely on dubious statements from remotely operating NGOs, instead of working on the problem of sexual violence in cooperation with the Sudanese government. How else can I explain that during the preparation of the report discussed today, the content of the report of the Sudanese Government Commission on this issue was completely ignored since February 2025? We believe that the solution to numerous problems of humanitarian, human rights, and food character in Sudan lies exclusively in achieving stable political regulation in this country. Taking into account the specifics of the interaction between the parties in the conflict, it is extremely important to overcome the problems of sexual violence in this country. In general, any discussion on the issues of women, peace, and security should be based on the implementation of the key Resolution 1325 and should be carried out in strict compliance with the mandate in it. The consideration of women's issues in the context of maintaining peace and security, and in relation to those situations that are included in the agenda of the Council. In this regard, we are categorically opposed to the skewing of debates in the direction of political and human rights aspects, and we urge to take this into account in the further work of the UN Security Council. Mr. Chairman, in accordance with the Geneva Convention on the Protection of the Civilian Population, during the War of 1949, as well as the additional protocols 1 on international armed conflicts and 2 on international character conflicts of 1977, the participating states are obliged to investigate the serious violations of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols for them. The Russian Federation is constantly adhering to its obligations to international human rights, including in compliance with the rights of prisoners of war. Therefore, we can say with confidence that the information contained in the annual UN General Secretary's report on the issues of sexual violence in the context of the conflict does not correspond to reality. In particular, the Russian law enforcement agencies do not have information and have not initiated criminal proceedings on any crimes of sexual nature committed by Russian military personnel in the Special Warfare Zone. We are well aware of the scandal surrounding the former Ukrainian ombudsman, Denisov. Moreover, the so-called sources of trust mentioned in the report are none other than the UN Ombudsman for Human Rights in Ukraine and the Independent International Commission on Inquiry into Violations in Ukraine, with which Russia has officially refused to cooperate due to the undisclosed involvement and exclusively anti-Russian nature of their activities. Therefore, it is not surprising that the relevant sections do not even contain hints of evidence, or at least indirect facts, that would allow us to establish the circumstances of the cases, the victims, the exact time, place, and so on. The accusations against Russian military personnel and officials in the context of sexual violence, in the context of the conflict, are based solely on anonymous sources and therefore are baseless. In other words, we are again in a situation similar to the statements of the aforementioned Mrs. Denisov, whose deliberate lie, which was subsequently admitted by even the Ukrainian side, was the basis of many charges against Russia. I would also like to remind you that the Ombudsman for Human Rights was created on the basis of a bilateral agreement between the Kiev authorities and the management of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thus, its mandate is extended not by the relevant resolutions of the UN Council on Human Rights, but by a direct agreement between Ukraine and the management. Thus, the UN Ombudsman for Human Rights in Ukraine has no right to conduct investigative actions, and its information has nothing to do with objectivity and reliability. And its commitment once again proves the fact that under the pretext of the need to ensure the protection of personal data of the victims and witnesses, it still refuses to provide a list of persons, presumably those who died in the clashes, thus confirming the staged and propagandistic nature of this disgusting provocation. Unfortunately, this unsightly situation fits into the style of the activities of the management of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in recent years under the leadership of Volker Turk. It is difficult to perceive such subsequent attempts to avoid the disclosure of facts and concrete evidence allegedly committed by our country of crimes, otherwise as orderly and engaged manipulations. Therefore, we decisively reject such approaches by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and those created by it in Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, another proof of the prejudice and engagement of the materials of the report is that they are prepared based on the inquiries of Ukrainian servicemen who were POWs in Russia and returned to Ukraine, as well as individuals from the territory controlled by Kiev, i.e., persons whose statements are a priori prejudiced. At the same time, references to violations of the rights of Russian servicemen who were POWs in Ukraine in terms of sexual violence in the context of the conflict are exhausted only by, I quote, 2 cases of threat of sexual violence. This does not coincide with reality at all. Moreover, the atrocities of the Kiev servicemen against civilians, in particular in the Kursk region, during the glorious military adventure of the Zelensky regime that ended in April, were not found in the report at all. This is despite the fact that sufficient detailed information on such crimes is publicly available. We held 3 informal UN Security Council meetings on the area formula on this topic, and sent evidence to the victims and eyewitnesses. Against this background, the accusation of us for refusing to cooperate with Ms. Patton raises doubts, especially in the context of our active dialogue with her office during the preparation of the review report. This office of Ms. Patton does not cooperate with us, because our recommendations and comments in the report were not taken into account. Taking all this into account, a legitimate question arises. What exactly is the purpose of our request for unhindered access to our territory if a special representative demonstrates such unpreparedness to cooperate with us? Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that crimes on sexual grounds during the conflict are absolutely disgusting and unacceptable. But the attempts to manipulate these stories and their politicization are no less disgusting. They underestimate the corresponding international efforts to provide punishment for such crimes, undermining the work of those who act honestly and unpretentiously. In addition, the double standards we mentioned today, manipulation of methodology and politicization of humanitarian stories, once again question the added value and effectiveness of the work of the special rapporteurs of the General Secretary as a whole. If Mr. Guterres is so happy about the increase in the effectiveness of the organization and the level of trust in the UN, then I recommend that he first of all focus on revising their methods of work in the interests of giving them genuine impartiality, especially in such a sensitive sphere as sexual violence in a conflict. So far, unfortunately, their activities do not reach even the most average expectations and minimally acceptable standards. Thank you for your attention.